Still 30?
All right.
It is what it is.
Now you're suitably refreshed, hopefully. Had a chance to look around. Good. And you had a chance perhaps to look at Amy's great facility here. I think we should move on. It's 10:30. Move on to our second presentation this morning. My pleasure to introduce Mr. John Baker. Of course, some of you may know that he was, although unfortunately he wasn't here in person, but we can fix that, to receive an award from STA for his work with the Wessyngton Plantation and the Washington family. So I am interested, fascinated by what he's done with his work there, and so I'm looking forward to him talking about his efforts there and how he has promoted that fascinating story to a wider audience. And so I'd like to introduce John Baker. And come forward.
Thank you all so much for inviting me. My research at Wessyngton started, which is located in Robertson County, Tennessee, when I was a young man of about 13 years old, about 40 years ago. My research started when I was in the 7th grade, and I spotted this photograph entitled Black Tennesseans. And each time I would go to class, I would stare at this photograph thinking perhaps I knew the individuals, I should know them. But I had no idea at that time that I was actually staring at my own great-great-grandparents. So shortly after I got out of school for summer vacation, it was Wessyngton Plantation's 160th anniversary. So our local newspaper, the Robertson County Times, did a feature story on the Washington family that owned Wessyngton, and then they also had this photograph. This time they had their names listed. So my maternal grandmother, Sally Washington, happened to be visiting us from Chicago, and she spent the weekend with her older brother, Bob Washington. And at the conclusion of her visit, she called my mother up and told her to have me to bring the camera out. And I said, Mama, why does Big Mama want me to bring the camera out to Uncle Bob's? And my mother was always very stern, and she said, just do like she said. So when I got there, my grandmother showed me this newspaper article, and I said, Big Mama, that picture's in our social studies textbook. Who is that? So she pointed and she told me that this gentleman was her grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was the cook on the plantation, and this was his wife, Henny Washington. She was the head laundress there, and there were 2 other relatives. So I was terribly excited. Couldn't wait to get back to school to tell my classmates that my great-great-grandparents' photograph was in our social studies textbook. Some of them believed me, some of them didn't. So my grandmother was very excited to see the photograph as well, because her grandparents had passed away before she knew them, but her older brother knew them personally. So he told me that the descendants of the white Washington family that owned Wessyngton still live there, and he said, well, call them up and tell them who you are. So the very next morning, I called and I spoke to Ann Consalvin Talbot, and she was a 6th-generation descendant of Joseph Washington, who founded Wessyngton Plantation in 1796. So when I told her that I'd seen the newspaper article, she said, well, everyone knows who your great-great-grandfather was because we still have his portrait in our living room. So this is a portrait of my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was born in Wessyngton April 23rd, 1824, and he died there in 1907. The Washington family commissioned Maria Howard Wheaton, who was an artist that specialized in painting African Americans during the late 1800s and early 1900s. This portrait is now valued at about $25,000, and it's in the possession of some of the Washington descendants. When I first met Miss Talbot, she brought out about 10 or 12 legal-sized documents which recorded the births of the slaves on Wessyngton from 1795 to 1860. So I was able to find my great-great-grandfather's exact date of birth. Emmanuel, born April 23rd, 1824, my great-great-grandmother, and some of our earlier ancestors as well. When I was a very small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, my grandfather, Joe Cobbs, would take me for a ride out in the country after church over. So And so often we would pass the entrance gate to Wessyngton, and my grandfather would either stop or slow down and point, and he would say, "That's Washington, that's where your grandmother's family came from." Which I knew my grandmother was a Washington, but that's as far as it went when I was 5 years old. So after I talked to Miss Talbot, she invited me out to Wessyngton, and so I had my mother to bring me out there, take me out there. So as soon as I got to the entrance gate, it dawned on me what my grandfather was telling me, that our family's history went back there some 200 years. This is the Wessyngton Mansion, and it was started in 1815 and completed in 1819. On my first trip there, it was pretty much like stepping back in time, because the Washingtons had some of the original furnishings. They had portraits of some of the other slaves there. This was a rocking chair that had been passed down to some of the slave descendants, and some other pieces of furniture. There were also 10 to 12 former slave cabins on the property, and in 1860 there were 40 cabins which housed 274 slaves, which was the largest slave population in the state of Tennessee at the time. Miss Talbot also took me to the slave cemetery where my great-great-grandfather and mother are buried, as well as some of our earlier ancestors. And this cemetery was used from 1798 to 1928. Miss Talbot also told me that the Washington family deposited all the plantation records in the Tennessee State Library and Archives in the 1960s. This is on 69 rolls of microfilm now. It's over 11,000 documents, and I've gone through all of these documents many, many times. There are many letters in this collection. George A. Washington, who was the second owner of Wessyngton, he traveled to New Orleans to sell the tobacco crops. He would go to Virginia and Maryland to purchase slaves, and he would go to New York to invest in the stock market. So while he was away, his father, Joseph Washington, his mother, the plantation overseer, and his wife would write letters, what's going on the plantation, which slave died, who had a child, who ran away, all this type of stuff. Even there's one letter that mentions 100 Native Americans coming up to the big house to get water before they were driven out on the Trail of Tears. There's especially lots of information during the Civil War period. There are many photographs of some of the former slaves and many plantation records. This is a document in 1865 when, after emancipation, and my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, agreed to work for the Washington family for $125 a year as the cook. And this is his cornbread recipe, and my mother's made it for me, and it's very good. This gentleman is Joseph Washington, and he came to Robertson County, Tennessee in 1796. When he first visited Robertson County, he went to the home of his cousin, Colonel Archer Cheatham. At this time, this lady was a small child, small enough to be carried in the arms. And so someone asked him when he was going to get married, he being a bachelor, and he said, well, I'll wait till she grows up and I'll marry her, which is what he did in 1812 when she was 16 and he was 42. This is the route Mr. Washington and the slaves would have taken from Southampton County, Virginia to Robertson County, Tennessee. And this would have taken about 2.5 months. And the slaves passed on to their descendants that they walked every step of the way. This is the second owner of Wessyngton, George A. Washington, and he was born there in 1815 and died there in 1892. This is his second wife, Jane Smith, and she was born in Florence, Alabama in 1830, and she passed away in Nashville in 1894 at the home of one of her daughters. In 2014, the Tennessee State Museum did an exhibit based on my book called Wessyngton, Slaves and Slaveholders of Wessyngton Plantation, and this is a model which represents about 60 acres of the plantation. It shows the main house surrounded by some of the slave cabins and other outbuildings. Slave population and source of slaves at Wessyngton. Mr. Washington lived in Southampton County, Virginia in 1795. He owned 5 slaves that were classified as being taxable. When he was in Tennessee in 1813, there were 33 slaves. By 1820, he owned 44, making him the second largest slave owner in Robertson County, Tennessee, second to his father-in-law, Colonel Archer Cheatham, who owned 88 slaves at that time. In 1830, he owned 80 slaves, 1840, 109, 1850, 143, and in 1860, his son, George A. Washington, owned 274 slaves, making him the largest slave owner in the state of Tennessee. Mr. Washington and his father received 16 slaves from 1801 through 1828 by inheritance from Mr. Washington's father, one of his brothers that never married, and from his father-in-law. They purchased 125 slaves from 1801 to 1843, and there was 195 of them born that I could document that were on the plantation from 1795 to 1860. In addition to the slave birth register, in the Wessyngton family collection, there's about 40 actual slave bills of sale, and this is one of my great-great-great-grandmother. Her name was Jenny. Originally, the family was owned in Sussex County, Virginia, by Colonel Michael Blow. He passed away in 1797, and 15 of our family members went to his son, Micaiah Blow. And in a couple of years, he became heavily indebted. He mortgaged the land that he had inherited from his father, and he sold my great-great-great-grandmother, Jenny, and her sister, Sarah, to Joseph Washington, and he brought them to Robertson County, Tennessee, and there's been 11 generations of our family that's lived there ever since. I've also created this document from slave bills of sale from Wessyngton from 1801 to 1843. It lists the names of every slave on the plantation that was purchased. It lists their dates of birth if it's indicated in the bill of sale, the date they were purchased, where, the type of sale, if it was a single sale or multifamily, and the price or where they came from. This is the first family that the Washingtons purchased where there was a mother, father, and children. And they purchased them from James Thompson, who was a relative of theirs, for $1,590. As you see here, the Union Bank of Nashville had loaned a plantation owner money to purchase 14 slaves, and they weren't able to pay for them. So the bank took possession of them again, and Mr. Washington went to Nashville and bought all 14 of them and brought them to Wessyngton. And this is made up of several connected families. In 1844, Mr. Washington married Margaret Adelaide Lewis, and her father, William B. Lewis, owned a plantation in Nashville called Fairfield. And as a wedding gift, he gave them 29 slaves for $1, and this included 7 interrelated families. Names of Wessyngton slaves. Oddly enough, I was able to trace some of the slaves from Wessyngton still retained African names as late as 1858. So in some instances, I was able to trace what tribes or ethnic groups they came from. Many of the slaves had biblical names such as Abednego, Emmanuel, or Joshua. There were many with classical names like Pompey. Most of the slaves named their children after their own family members, especially males. Some of them were given place names. There was a Carolina Tom because when they purchased him, there was already 2 Toms on the plantation. There were several slaves named after the presidents, Harrison, Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Washington. And several of the slaves on the plantation named their children after the Washington family members who had a closer relationship to them. In 2003, I found that the Wessyngton DNA Project in Robertson County, there are still thousands of direct descendants of slaves there. So I approached various descendants and asked them if they would participate in the DNA project. So I was able to trace what ethnic backgrounds they came from using DNA technology. Labor division on the plantation. The men primarily worked under a task system, which meant that the owner assigned a certain task. Of course, they knew about how much work an average man could do to take up your whole day. However, some of the people that could accomplish this early was able to work on their own tobacco crops, and then Mr. Washington would keep up with how much tobacco they raised, and then when it was sold, he would give them part of the proceeds. There was also other crops produced on the plantation. There were blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, and there was also a large whiskey operation on the plantation where they used all the surplus corn that didn't go into feeding the livestock and the families. They produced corn liquor. There was also a large pork processing operation on the plantation. You could find Washington hams on the menus of the most exquisite restaurants as far south as New Orleans, as far north as Philadelphia. The women on the plantation were not allowed to do any outside work in the fields. They cultivated gardens. They did sewing and weaving, domestic work, processed pork, milking, caring for the children, the elderly and sick, and cooking for their own families. And there was also a nursery on the plantation where women that were too old to work watched the children while their mothers did gardening and so forth. This is a photograph of some white and black sharecroppers in Wessyngton in the early 1900s. After emancipation, many of the slaves went to Nashville. Some of them moved out west, up north. So Mr. Washington then hired other African Americans and whites that surrounded the plantation to work on the farm. This is from a hog killing at Wessyngton, and this is a group of men processing the pork. This is a group of women also doing part of that processing. This is a smokehouse at Wessyngton, and this building is still standing. Each week on Saturday, the women would line up and they'd be given so many pounds of pork, sugar, flour, depending on the number of individuals in their households. And this is a lady preparing to do the wash. Much harder than the washing machine today. This is a tobacco field on Wessyngton Plantation. In 1860, Wessyngton encompassed 13,100 acres in one continuous farm. In 1860, the slaves there produced 250,000 pounds of dark fired tobacco, making them the largest producers of dark fired tobacco in the United States and the second largest in the world. And this would have taken about 350 acres on the cultivation at that time. And this is the smokehouse there at Wessyngton, closer shot. Slave marriages were not recognized by law. However, in some slave bills of sale, they indicate that the people are husband and wife. And this is Tom and Jenny, which were the first nuclear family that the Washingtons purchased, and it indicates that Jenny is Tom's wife. There's also a notation in Mr. Washington's diary in 1851 that another slave named Tom asked Olive for his wife. And then I have several slaves' pension records where they indicate that they were married before emancipation by Horace Carr, who was also an enslaved African American, and he married a lot of slaves in their community before and after the Civil War. There were also several slaves that were married by the Freedmen's Bureau. Rebellion and punishment on the plantation. There were several slaves that ran away. They aided others who ran away. They left the plantation without permission. They fought overseers, refused to work, broke tools to slow down the workforce. They rode draft animals at night, making them too tired to do work. There were work slowdowns. Of course, they had disputes among themselves, so some of them, there's evidence that they got into fights. Some pretended to be sick. Mr. Washington notated pretty much everything that went on the plantation in his diary. He mentioned that he went to the home of one of the slaves named Reuben, and he determined that he was too sick, and he told him not to go to work. Two other slaves, he said, were pretending to be sick, and so he told them to go to work, and the next day he mentions in his diary that they did not go to work. How this was dealt with was they could be whipped, confined, others not allowed to visit the plantation, or them not allowed to go to other plantations, and ultimately sell, which there were only two slaves that were ever sold from the plantation from 1796 to 1865. I've also created this document from 1838 to 1862, which lists various types of rebellion by slaves from Wessyngton. And this is some of the first documentation I have of slaves that ran away from Wessyngton, which I'm sure there were some earlier than that. But there's one slave named Jack who was 18 years old. He ran away in September of 1838. He was out until the beginning of October, and he was captured in Cadiz, Kentucky. A $30 reward was offered for his return. There was another slave named Lewis, and he made it into free territory before he was captured and brought back to the plantation. And then there was Davy, who was also caught in Evansville. And on his fourth attempt, Mr. Washington sold him in New Orleans. And after the Civil War, he came back to Wessyngton, where he had four brothers. And then they went to Cheatham County, and from there they went to Nashville, where some of their direct descendants remain. I was very fortunate when I started my research because I was able to interview children and grandchildren of former Wessyngton slaves who ranged in age from 80 to 107 years old. This is my maternal grandmother, Sally Washington, and she passed away when she was 85 years old. And so far in my direct Washington line, no one has died under 80 since the 1700s. My mother passed away last year. She was 86. My grandmother was 85. My great-grandfather was 84. My great-great-grandfather was 83. And his mother, who was born in 1792, was at least 80 when she passed away. So I hope I won't break our record. This is my grandmother's brother, Bobby Washington, and his wife, Maggie Washington. She passed away when she was 99 in 2003. And she was the last individual that was around from the beginning of my research. This lady was Maddie Terry, and she passed away when she was 93. She and I attended church together, so she told me many stories about her ancestors who had been enslaved at Wessyngton. This is my cousin Joseph Washington, and I met him when this picture was taken on his 102nd birthday, and he died a few weeks before he turned 107. This lady is Mrs. Ann Nixon Cooper, and she died 19 days before she turned 108. And you may have seen her on CNN. She's the lady that President Obama mentioned voting for him when she was over 100 years old. Miss Maddie Terry told me that her great-grandmother, Sarah Cheetah Washington, was born a slave at Wessyngton in 1810, and she died when she was 104 years old. And Miss Maddie said that she would often gather her grandchildren and great-grandchildren up and tell them stories about when they were enslaved at Wessyngton. Wessyngton sits on a high hill, and back behind the main house it slopes down, and then the land levels out, and there's a stream that runs through there. And her great-grandmother told her that when they were children, they went to the creek banks, collected clay, brought it up on the hill where Wessyngton now stands, and the adults molded and made the bricks. And she said evidently they knew what they were doing because the house is still standing. She also stated that her great-grandmother at 104 years old could still chop her own firewood and could thread a needle without using glasses. And it never went sick. This is my cousin Joseph Washington, and I met him in Mansfield, Ohio. And so I took a number of photographs of some of the former slaves at Wessyngton, and he could readily identify all of them and tell me stories about them. And I asked him, did he know my great-great-grandmother and father? And he said, well, of course I knew them. We lived in handshaking distance. And I said, what's that? And he said, our houses were so close together you could reach over and shake your neighbor's hand. And he told me that my great-great-grandfather had a beautiful singing voice, and he used to lead most of the songs in their prayer services, and he even sang some of them for me. This is Mrs. Ann Nixon Cooper, and she told me that after President Obama mentioned her, the people as far as Japan had came to her house to interview her. And she said, everybody's making such a big deal about this like I didn't even have a life before he mentioned my name. So she said, I've had a very interesting life. So she wrote a book called A Century and Some Change, My Life Before the President Called My Name. And at 103 years old, she could still dance in high heel shoes. During the Civil War, some of the slaves at Wessyngton emancipated themselves by running away. So Mr. Washington came to the conclusion that he would try to get as many of them to stay there as he could. So he offered 18 men to pay them $10 per month if they would stay on the plantation and work for him. So they agreed. And so later they got together and said, well, he's just trying to keep us on the plantation. So all 18 of them ran away. And he listed the exact dates or the months that they ran away. I also have pension applications for many of the slaves that enlisted in the Union Army. And one of them was Frank Washington. And he stated that he went into service when he was 13 years old, because he said by the time he was 12, he was as large as most full-grown men. So when Union troops came through the area, taking men to work on the military fortifications and enlisting them in the Army, they took him too. And he remembered his mother running out of the house saying he's only 12, but they took him in. This is United States Colored Troops in Nashville in 1864. This is the military fortifications, Fort Negley in Nashville, and some of the former slaves from Wessyngton helped in this construction. This is a photograph of my great-great-grandfather and mother with some of their children and grandchildren in Wessyngton in the late 1800s. And some people ask, well, why did they come back to the same plantation that they were enslaved on? Some of the former slaves worked for other people who lived around Wessyngton, and after they had worked for them at the end of the year, they were not able to pay them. So Mr. Washington invested in the stock market many years before the Civil War. So he was actually wealthier after the Civil War than he was before. He was worth $400,000 in 1870, which would probably make him a multimillionaire. So they knew at least that if they worked for him, that he was able to pay them. So that's why some of them did return there. This is the Antioch Baptist Church, which is close to Wessyngton, and it was founded in 1869 by former Wessyngton slaves and others in the community. Its first pastor was Edmund White Washington, and he and his wife also served as teachers at Antioch, which they used that as a school until one of the Fifth Jubilee singers could be hired as a teacher there. And they had to pay $1 per month per child, which was a great sacrifice because they were only making like 50 cents a day. And I found that individuals as old as 40 and 50 years old were going to school to learn how to read and write. And this is a photograph of some of the Antioch Baptist Church members getting baptized in the late 1880s. And this is the daughter of a Wessyngton slave with her school class in the early 1900s. And there's about as many men and boys in the class as girls, which that's unusual for that time period. This is Rachel Washington Terry and Wiley Terry, and I got this portrait from their daughter who passed away a week before she turned 103 years old. And Wiley and two of his sons purchased 429 acres, part of the land that they had formerly been enslaved on, and some of that land is still in the possession of their direct descendants. And this is their son, Sally Terry, and his wife with their 1918 Model T Ford, and they're the first African Americans in our county that we can document it on the card. They also donated some of their land to start an African American school there. And this is Fannie Williams and Wesley Williams. They were not born in Wessyngton, but they came to Wessyngton after the war as sharecroppers. And you'll notice that Fannie looks Native American. So I got this portrait from their granddaughter who passed away when she was 99. And many of the family members say she was full-blooded Cherokee, like most people say that they got Native American ancestry. And so on all records it listed she was African American. I got 3 of her children's death certificates, all of them listed her with a different maiden name. One census record stated that she was born in Virginia, one in West Virginia, one in Tennessee. I grew up with her great-great-grandchildren, so I had one of her great-great-grandsons to do a DNA test through her mother's line, and it showed that she had African ancestry through her mother's side of the family. Another lady who was a great-granddaughter, I had her to do an admixture test, which tells what percentages makes up your DNA. So she came back with 18%, which is extremely high for African Americans, which would have been about equivalent if Fannie would have been half Native American. Many of her descendants said she was extremely mean. She told fortunes with decks of cards, and she poisoned one of her daughters-in-law to death, which she didn't like. This is George A. Washington in his later years with his wife, Jane. This is Wessyngton Plantation in 1892, and at that time it encompassed 13,100 acres. Mr. Washington wanted his son, Joseph Edwin Washington, to inherit the home place, and the rest of the children drew lots out of a hat to determine what part of the plantation that they would receive as an inheritance. And this is a photograph taken of the Washington family the same day as my family's photograph was taken there. This is Mr. Washington and his wife Jane with some of their children and their in-laws. Then this is the Wessyngton Mansion. Mr. Washington left a stipulation in his will that his children would not receive their full inheritance until they were 30. So when his son George A. Washington Jr. turned 30, he built this home called Washington Hall. It was 44 rooms, 3-story white brick with a ballroom that could accommodate 250 guests. And some of the crown heads of Europe, such as the Prince of Greece, had been entertained there. There was also, many of you no doubt have seen Gone with the Wind and remember the staircase that Scarlett O'Hara falls down. It was fashioned after the staircase in Washington Hall. This is Glenn Raven and Mr. Washington's daughter, Jane Washington Ewing, built this home, and she and her brother stayed in fierce competition with one another, having lavish parties, and they were trying to outdo one another. Several years ago, a monument was erected in the slave cemetery at Wessyngton, and I, at that time, was able to document 39 individuals by interviewing older relatives who still remember going to burials there as children. So some of the Washington descendants went in together and put this monument up. It's probably one of the largest in the state of Tennessee. It has the names of 446 enslaved people on Wessyngton from 1798, and they were buried there as late as 1928. I have a cross indicating the names of the individuals that I know to be buried there, and that's about 100 individuals. We did ground penetrating radar there a couple of years ago, and it's estimated that there's about 200 people buried there at all. And on the back there is a spiritual walk with me, Lord, walk with me while I'm on this tedious journey. I want Jesus to walk with me. And it says, dedicated to the 446 African Americans enslaved on Wessyngton Plantation from its founding in 1796 until their emancipation in 1865. May this memorial honor their memories and those whose names are unknown. An estimated 200 men, women, and children are buried in this sacred place. And when we had the dedication ceremony, there were probably 15 individual families whose ancestors came from Wessyngton. And there was also members of the white Washington family there as well. Our family has been having a Washington family reunion, I guess, for 70 years or so. So in 2000, as part of that reunion, we toured Wessyngton. And this is the same spot that my great-great-grandparents' photograph was taken there in 1891. At that time, my great-aunt, Maggie Washington, was 97 years old. So she had present herself, her children, her grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and great-great-great-grandchildren. I also have a cousin, Maxine Washington, who lives in Indianapolis, Indiana, and she's 94. And I have a picture of her with her mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-great-grandmother. She now has great-great-great-grandchildren herself, so she's actually seen 9 generations of her family. This is how Wessyngton looks today. This is the Wessyngton Mansion. In 1983, Wessyngton was purchased by Glenn and Donna Roberts, and up to its sale, it was the largest farm in America, still owned by the direct descendants that founded it. This is the slave cemetery at Wessyngton. This is a restored slave cabin, and this is the Washington family cemetery, which is close to the main house, and there's 4 generations of the Washington family buried there. This is a book signing that I did when my book first came out at Barnes and Nobles, and we had many African American descendants as well as some of the descendants of the slave owners. Many families in Robertson County still have family reunions. This is the Gardner family, and they've held a family reunion every year since 1935. This is the Green family, and I think this was in the 1930s as well. This is a branch of my family, the Cobbs family, and we started this reunion in 1999. For many years, I told some of the white Washington descendants that they needed to get together and have a family reunion because I knew more of them than they knew of each other. So when the Tennessee State Museum did the Slaves and Slaveholders exhibit, they got together and came to Nashville because they're spread all over the country. So they came to Wessyngton and I gave them a tour. And I said, well, you all should take a photograph in the same spot that your ancestors did in 1891. They said, well, that's a good idea, John, but you need to be in the photograph with us because if it hadn't been for you, we would still not know each other. So I joined in that photograph. And this is the faces of some of the individuals in Wessyngton. My research is not just about my family, it's about all those that were there at Wessyngton. And even with the exhibit, this has flushed out a number of pictures from a lot of people that had photographs in attics. And I went to a birthday party a month ago, a lady who turned 100 years old, and her grandmother was born enslaved at Wessyngton, so she had other photographs of her grandmother, her great-grandmother. She also had other stories that I'd never heard before. So it continues on. Some people say, you mean you've been working on this 30 years? How long did it take to trace your family tree?
Oh my God.
I said, I've been tracing everybody on the plantation family tree. So this is my family tree that spans from 1760 to 2013.
Wow.
There's over 1,000 of us. And I've done some others that have more than this.
Amazing.
And it took me about 12 hours to do this by hand. For many years, I've been collecting documents, research, interviewing people. And so my mother stayed on me for a number of years, and she said, John, I was the valedictorian in my class. She said I could read something once and I could recite it just like you can, all the stuff about the people at Wessyngton. And she said, now I don't know where I put my keys at the time. You've got information in your drawers in your room. You've got it under the bed, in the closet, here, there, and everywhere. And when something happens to you, all that stuff is going to be, down the drain. So I thought about what my mother said. So I worked for about 2.5 years to detail all the history of Wessyngton and all those families. So in 2009, Simon & Schuster published my book, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, Stories of My Family's Journey to Freedom, in which I said earlier, it's not just my family, but it's the history of all those who are there in Wessyngton. So I also have a website, Wessyngton.com, where you can find information about my research in the book as well. NPT also did a documentary called Wessyngton, A Family's Road to Freedom, and they did a very good job with it as well. That concludes my presentation, and at this time I'll take any questions if anyone has any. Yes.
Was there a chapel on the plantation prior to the Civil War?
No, there was not. That's the one thing that all descendants, I've interviewed people from California to New York to Florida, and all descendants of slaves say that they were not allowed to worship on the plantation, that they had to do it secretly.
Was there any evidence of a pottery on the plantation?
Yes, I did have.
I didn't see it in your list.
In all the process of finding all those occupations, where was the research for that? In his diary or in other records?
Some of it was in diaries, some of it was in bills of sale, like in some of the bills of sale, it would indicate that a man is a blacksmith or carpenter and so forth. And then when they assign work, they may say Weaver, Jenny, or something like that, or another position. And some of the grandchildren and children of some of these slaves told me, what positions they held prior to emancipation. Yes.
Are there still field stones, or are there any markers in the African American?
There were field stones in the cemetery, yes. And it was pretty much left in its original condition until the late 1980s.
How many number of descendants today are there from the former slaves of the plantation?
It could be hundreds of thousands, because it's like, from one couple, it's 1,000 in my family. One family, the Terry family, that I did theirs for their family reunion a couple of years ago. They've got about 2,500 people in their family. The Gardners is probably, I would say, 18 to 2,000 in
You
their
got 1,000 in your family.
So, and that's just a few families, so it
Right.
could be thousands and thousands.
You said only 2 of the slaves were sold
Right.
during all that time. All the rest of them brought to the plantation.
Once they got there, they stayed there intact. And in some families, there was as many as 5 generations there at one time.
Is that an anomaly for?
Yes, it's very unusual, but the one thing, the Washingtons were so wealthy that it never necessitated selling any of them. So, and then when Joseph Washington died in 1848, he only had one son, so all of them was inherited by the one son. So otherwise, if he had 10 children, they'd all been split up between them.
Do you still have any gaps? I mean, it's a very impressive chart, but do you have any gap? Most genealogists complain that they hit a roadblock or something, or they can't find something. Any notable gaps that you're still searching?
Not through the Washingtons,
Not the Washingtons.
on some other branches.
Have you gone past their time at Wessyngton for other ancestry beyond that time frame?
Yes, because through the bills of sale, like for instance, Emmanuel, my great-great-grandfather, his mother was brought from Virginia by Mr. Washington, Joseph Washington, in 1802. So the Blow family was a very prominent family in Sussex County, Virginia. So I have their records from when our family first came from Africa to Virginia. Yes.
On the map of Africa, the locations of a lot of the enslaved people that their DNA is from, are those typical ports of exit?
Right. Most of them were from West Africa, which I would expect. There was one person whose ancestry was from Somalia, and even the DNA people questioned that, and they ran, several more tests on them and found out that was the case. So I guess that was the case of somebody being in the wrong place at the same
Yeah.
time. That was very unusual
Yeah.
to be on the east coast of Africa.
I'm going to ask, I know a lot of people seem to have trouble researching African American genealogy, so do you have any tips that you could share with us? Anything that you found especially helpful while you were tracing your ancestry?
Most of it, I would say, to start with elders, because they can give you information. Say, for instance, if you, which the 1870 census is the first one that's going to list African Americans on it. So say, for instance, if my great-great-grandfather was on the 1870 census, his brother is living next door to him. If they're, say, 40 or 50 years old, more likely than not, they're going to die before they make it to the time frame that you have death certificates that list who their parents are. But if you interview relatives, they can say, well, Emmanuel's brother was named Tom and so forth. And they also have a pattern of naming family members after uncles and aunts to keep the continuity of the families. So first, I would say to interview relatives before even starting on the research, because they can give you much more information that you'll find out in records. And now my great-great-grandfather, for instance, he died in 1907 before they had death certificates, but his sister lived to be 100 years old. So I was able to get their parents' names from that and then link that to other Wessyngton records.
Did you find any research in any of the county records in Robinson County about these families?
Yes, a lot of them.
Or just plantation records?
No, in addition to using the plantation records, which is very extensive, I use wills, deeds, court cases, all kinds of stuff. I've spent many years in the archives in Springfield as well as in Nashville. Other questions? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.